Hi everyone, Mr. Silbaugh here, and this is the recording for day 5 of Module 1, Markup Language and Site Development Essentials. Alright, so in the last class we talked about having a good web design, which is dependent on the three technologies of HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. HTML5 allows for structure and presentation of the page, it gives you all of your content, and CSS allows for the formatting and the style, gives that a little something extra like font colors, different fonts, all sorts of things. This we'll find out in the next unit. And also JavaScript, which allows for a dynamic and interactive web page. We'll talk about JavaScript in this course, but we won't dive into it too in depth. So let's talk about the principles of web development. This first unit is all about getting you set up for success in designing your first website. You need to know more than markup language and be a talented designer to make a successful website. It's more than just knowing the skills. You have to know how to incorporate them and use them properly in order to make a great website. You also need to be aware of some of the business and legal aspects of web design as well. There's a lot of that goes into this. And we'll also talk about the aspects of being part of a successful design team. So this first part is going to talk about the project management and web development cycle. Okay. When we are talking about a project such as a web design and building that, you're going to have very many moving parts. Okay. If you're working freelance, meaning you're working by yourself, you're going to be working with your companies that have hired you, companies that want to make sure that what you make is correct and aligned with what they're looking for and their standards, and so on and so forth. We'll talk more about those in the rest of the units, but it's important to realize that if you are working, independently, you'll have to report to different people. But at the same time, if you are working for someone, like a company, and you're building the website for a company, you do need to know some of the stuff about the company and who you report to. Creating a website typically involves teams or individuals that work on the same project. To be successful, you must outline and communicate the steps of the project. Communication in web design is key. You must communicate between various people and you must have open communication with them. You may not be a manager for the project, but you'll still contribute and help to build. So this is the development cycle, and this is what the course kind of says are the ways that you build and create your website from start to finish. We'll talk about all of these steps and the ways that it works throughout the next several days. So we'll pretty much be into Wednesday and Thursday of next week talking about these different ways that sites are developed. The first is to create and document an initial plan. This is where you're going to start thinking about what your website's going to look like, start getting information, all of the stuff that you need to start building up a plan. You want to go in with a plan and know how you're going to build this website from start to finish. Okay. This is where you'll do some different sketches and some ideas and all of that good fun stuff. Next, you're going to obtain relevant input from stakeholders. You'll talk with the stakeholders, people who are going to be part of your team, people who are part of the company, people who might actually be using your website. You're going to get as much information and data as you can about the people who will be actively using your website. Next, you're going to communicate the website plan. You're going to talk about how you're going to tell your stakeholders what the plan is, what the how it's going to go, things of that nature. You're going to say all of the stuff. This is going to be first, second, third, so on and so forth. Next, you're going to consider the technical and non-technical concerns. When we say technical and non-technical concerns, this is talking about people who are unfamiliar with web design, who are unfamiliar with technology, and you kind of have to make it to their level. Okay, some of the stuff that you're learning is very high up and new to you, but consider the people who don't even know it to begin with. Okay, you're learning about it, you're being informed about it. You have to consider the people that are not going to know anything about it, and you have to communicate some of the technical aspects to it to your stakeholders and people that you're going to be developing your website for. Then, after that, finally, you can start building your website. Then after that, you'll publish it to the web, make it accessible for all people, and then you'll manage the site. This means that you will take the time to update it and keep it looking fresh and all of the other things that you need to do in order to manage and maintain your website. All right, the first thing that we're going to talk about is a very important topic, and it's going to be a recurring theme throughout our units, is how we develop accessible web pages. Okay, there are many people who have different disabilities and different needs and different things that are going to either prohibit or inhibit their ability to view websites. Okay, accessibility must be in mind so that your pages are available to all visitors. Okay, if you have a company intranet where you're not going to have to worry about too many people with disabilities, that's great. Okay, you may still have some others to worry about, but you're going to accommodate them specifically. If your website is available to everyone on the web, you have to accommodate every single potential possibility. Now, that may seem like a lot, but it's really not. There are different ways to get around it and to make it so that everyone has access. All right, so one of the examples that our text gives is the older generation, okay? Individuals who are older, they start losing their sight, they start losing their hearing, those things start to diminish as they get older. But there's still people that can view websites. I know several older Americans who are accessing web pages and websites who still can do it, but they need some support. Okay, so how can we accommodate them? And if we don't, we can lose their business, and our website won't be as successful. It only takes one wrong thing on your website to make people go away and never come back. So this first part of this section on development principles is going to talk about the different laws and requirements that we have. So the first one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. This was enacted in 1990 to protect disabled individuals and Americans. There's a broad amount of standards to influence commercial and social practices for people with disabilities. When we talk about commercial, we're talking about businesses, companies, and social practices, things that people should be doing in order to accommodate people with disabilities. This law is a very, very big law. There's a lot to it and a lot of components. Some of the things that the text highlights is equal employment opportunities. So like even a web design, if you have someone who is blind or someone who requires use of braille, they have mobility issues, you still have to hire them if they are qualified for a position. They bring a lot to the table, and they can do a lot for you. You have to accommodate them and help them with that as well if you do choose to hire them and have them a part of your team. Okay. And the next one is public accommodations, and this kind of falls more into our realm of designing a web page for someone who has a disability. Electronic information must be accessible. That means, if someone who is blind goes on a website, they still should be able to access it. And we'll talk about how they can access it in a little bit. If you don't comply, you could be fined. All right, but the fines won't apply to you. Don't be afraid, a middle school student, you're going to get fined. We'll talk about it. According to the United States Department of Justice, this applies to cyberspace communications as well. So emails, anything transmitted over the internet. The United States Department of Justice in September of 1996 said covered entities under the ADA are required to provide effective communication regardless of whether they generally communicate through print media, audio media, or computerized media such as the internet. Covered entities that use the internet for communications regarding their programs, goods, or services must be prepared to offer those communications through accessible means as well. Essentially, what this is telling us is that a business or organization must have communication that is accessible to all individuals, regardless if it's through print, audio, or computerized media through the internet, so on and so forth. They must make them accessible to all individuals. All right, so some more about ADA. It is an active law. This applies to everyone and anyone making pages and sites. This includes you, but hold on. Known as the U.S. Department of Justice ADA standards for accessible design. If you're curious about those, you can look them up. The penalties are sought by the Department of Justice, not an individual or group. So they're through the U.S. Department of Justice. The Department of Justice tries to determine good faith before issuing a lawsuit. What this is saying is they're not just going to be like, oh, you're not accessible, oop, you're not accessible, and start, issuing lawsuits. No. They want to see if, you've actually made an attempt, you're doing the work to make it accessible, and things of that nature. They're going to look and see if and they'll probably, if it's really something major, they'll probably try and reach out and, have you try and correct it. This is mostly only if you're like a company or entity. Being a student is not going to get you on the Department of Justice watch list for, not using accessible materials on your website. It's in general habitual offenders, people who are repeatedly doing it, people who are in large companies and corporations. Those are the ones that get the lawsuits, and those are the ones that get fined. Okay, you're gonna be safe, I promise. All right, so between us, when it comes to the ADA, the Department of Justice makes a reasonable accommodation. Okay, you have to attempt. You have to, make it so that it's accessible. If you work for or own a company, government, employment agency, and or labor union, you must make an accommodation of your website. Your website that you may develop, as long as it's not like something major for a different major company or part of the government or an employment agency, your labor union, you're going to be fine. Make accommodations as best as you can. However, if it is something that is going to be a lot more recognizable, a lot more out there to the public, then yes, you do need to make as many accommodations as possible. So some of the biggest compliance factors that they've found with the ADA, that images have text descriptions. What this means is if you take your mouse on a website and you put it over the computer or over the picture, there should be a little box that pops up and it describes what it is. Okay. Those can be read by screen readers. They read the screen to people who cannot see, and that is very important that that goes in, and we'll talk about that. It's a very easy thing to do. Another one is providing text-based alternatives to non-text content, so like images, media, video, audio. You should need to provide both the original content, and you also need to provide a text-based alternative. So if you have a movie, you have a transcript of the movie. If you have an audio clip, you have a text-based audio clip. Okay, and then forms that are easily read by screen reading technology. You want to make sure that anything that's on your website can be read by a screen reader. All right, and if you are curious and want to find out more, you can check out ada.gov, and that will help you and explain more about it. There's additional websites, but we'll look at some of those later. All right, next is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. I've been trying to figure out if there's like an acronym saying to this, but I always just call it WCAG. Essentially, web pages need to be accessible to all. We know this from the ADA. W3C, the people who have authored the HTML5 standards, they're involved with a lot. They have made the Web Accessibility Initiative, also called WAY. WAY has made the WCAG. So W3C made WAY, and WAY made WCAG. Okay. W3C is the big authoring committee that makes all of the standards for the web, that decides what happens and goes on within web design. They made a section called WAY, which is the Web Accessibility Initiative. It's a part of W3C. And then the WAY has made the standards WCAG. Okay, I hope that clears that up because there's a lot of acronyms going on here. So it is used to promote a high degree of usability for people with disabilities. And WAY works with organizations and technology guidelines, tools, education, and outreach and development. This essentially is not a law. This is a set of standards to help you comply with various laws in like the United States and across the globe. This is very important. They're standards. There's a lot to them. It's a very big page document. You'll see them in the lab for today, but you're going to want to briefly go over them and explore some of them. There's a lot to it, okay? Don't get overwhelmed. So WAY is the company, or the organization rather, from the W3C. WAY made the standards. WAY makes sure that HTML, CSS, XML, and all of those are accessible to all. So let's say, for example, someone with a visual disability who is unable to view a presentation on the web. The coding in HTML allows them to include text equivalents of the presentation in the code, and it could be presented in Braille or as in speech. WAY works with W3C groups, so remember W3C is the big organization that makes the HTML standards and things for the web. WAY works with the other offshoots of the W3C in order to make sure that they are meeting the standards and making sure they are creating accessibility options. For today in the lab, you are going to look at some of those standards and explore some of those. All right, next is the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. This was presented in June 21st, 2021, or 2001 rather, goodness. It created what's called Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. It requires federal agencies to provide accommodations for electronic and information technology developed, produced, maintained, or used by federal agencies. This is a federal specific requirement of an act, okay? This applies to government websites, okay? This is to ensure that disabled individuals have a comparable level of access to information. Web page design and other computer-based elements do not limit access information by disabled users. This is all for government websites, okay? If you go to the IRS website, or you go to the Department of Justice website, or if you go to the Supreme Court website, any website within the government has to meet the 508 standards, which are the following. Non-text elements must have text-based equivalent. We have already talked about this in the previous slides, that if it is something that is visual, there's a text equivalent to it. Multimedia equivalent information must line up so that disabled persons are not at a disadvantage. What this is saying is, if you have a video and you have a transcript, okay, the way that the video is playing, the transcript must line up, okay? It must be equivalent. Information must be equally available in color and without color. This means that they can access the website fully in color or fully without color in black and white. Documents must be made available without requiring an associated style sheet, okay? This is essentially saying, can the website be created and reproduced without having a style sheet, a CSS page? Can they have no formatting? That's fine, okay? Is it just content? That's exactly what it's asking. Text descriptions must be made available for all image maps. We'll talk about image maps. Image maps are essentially different areas and hotspots where you can click. Imagine you have a big picture of the world on your computer or on a web page. You could click on the different continents. Essentially, there would be a text description for each of those links. Okay, image maps we'll talk about later. That's in an advanced topic in this course, but we'll talk about those later. Client-side image maps should not be used. This is essentially saying stuff that is put on the computer. It should not be used. Tables identify all rows and column headers. We'll talk about tables. Essentially, when you have a table, you have a description at the top of each of the tables for what each of the rows are. And if there's column headers, columns on the side that have different data or different rows, you have to have both descriptions for your tables. You also, if it has a frame, it must have titles that enable browsers to navigate through the frame. Essentially, if you have stuff around your website where you have it in different frames, you have to have borders that will navigate through the frames and be able to read the content through them. It's optional, but you can have a separate text-only site if you so choose. And if scripting technology is used, a plain, non-fancy alternative must be available. All right, your assignment now is to work on exercise 1.3 and lab 1.2. Exercise 1.3 is in the exercises and activities folder in Schoology. Lab 1.2 is step by step. Don't pay attention to these instructions. The correct instructions will be posted in Schoology. If you have questions, please let me know, and I'd be happy to help you point you in the right direction. That's going to do it for this lesson.